Well, good afternoon, I guess, everyone. Thanks for popping on a Friday here. We're happy to kind of kick off the legislative recap for the 2025 session with Minnesota Farm Bureau here. My name is Loren Dauer. I'm Director of Public Policy. I'm going to have Hunter introduce himself before the recap gets started here. Just wanted to run through a couple bit of logistics here. If you would be so kind as to keep yourself muted throughout the presentation, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. If you can see your profile picture and it doesn't have your name on it, if you could be so kind as to change that for us, we would appreciate that. And hopefully no one has any connection problems, but yeah, we will run through the presentation here. It should last about 30 to 45 minutes. And then just so that everyone is aware, we are recording this presentation so that we can post it in our Impact Weekly newsletter, as well as our website and on our YouTube page. So with that, does anyone have any quick questions before we get started? Perfect. I will turn it over to Hunter to get started.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. So I think I know most of you, but my name is Hunter Pederson. I'm a public policy specialist. When the legislature is in session, I'm at the Capitol pretty much every day there, monitoring what's going on, meeting with lawmakers and, weighing in on behalf of our members, our Farm Bureau members. With lawmakers and, different policies, different ideas. Um, we concluded the legislative session on Monday. Well, I guess actually it was technically Tuesday, June 10th. Um, and the legislature completed the rest of the state budget, which is great. Today we're going to kind of just recap the session for you, talk about what passed, what didn't pass, and just kind of give you the lowdown on everything. So we'll start with just kind of high level, an overview session, some of the high level outcomes of the session, and then we're gonna get more into the details of, what we as an organization supported, what we opposed, couple honorable mentions, that you might find interesting, and then once we get to the end there, we'll have plenty of time for questions. So with that, we will jump in here. Overall, I think we had a really effective session. Um, I think our members' voices were heard. We had access to lots of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. And when there were questions about agriculture or, where Farm Bureau stood on a particular position, legislators reached out to us and they relied on us and listened to what we had to say. Um, and, We actually, I'm just looking at the picture here. We had a really great tour over the legislative break up in Stearns County with Majority Leader Aaron Murphy and Senator and Senate Agriculture Chair Eric Putnam at the Coltis Farm. Shout out to our Stearns County board and Tara, our great MMS in that area, for setting that up. But I think that's just one great example of some of the ways that we engage our members with legislators. And so, a lot of this stuff does happen at the Capitol, but, the more that we can get people involved with our members outside of the Capitol too is also great. Um, we had our day on the Hill in March. We had great attendance. We had over 170 members that came out. Were able to go meet with their legislators and, deliver their perspective as Farm Bureau members. Um, Towards the end of session, early May, we had a really great board day on the Hill where we were able to meet with the governor, legislative leaders, and some of the staff to legislative leaders, and just try to, really drive home our final message, our some of our final key priorities as the session was coming to a close. And then testimony, between the public policy team and some of our members, we both verbal and written, we delivered over 40 testimonies this session, which it's important to obviously get out there and have our voice heard as an organization. But I think just having the consistency of weighing in on, what matters to Farm Bureau as an organization, what matters to you guys as our members. When legislators have questions or they're thinking about an idea, that's the kind of involvement too that again helps us be at the forefront of their mind when they're trying to figure out who to talk to about a particular policy or idea. So I think that just all really speaks to how effective we are. And I really do have to give a shout out to you guys, our members, um, everything that we do and everything that's in our policy book is stuff that you guys put in there. I don't go up to the Capitol and just lobby on how I'm feeling that day or, what the issue of the day happens to be. It's driven by you guys and what you do. So really can't say thank you enough for your involvement, and your ideas and just everything you guys do to drive this organization forward. So thank you for that. Um, and as a session, I think every session is different. Every session is really interesting, but this one we came in, I think coming in, we knew there were going to be challenges and opportunities given that we had very divided government, right? So, um, there was, certainly a saga of events after the election and in the session as well, regarding the makeup of the legislature. But essentially, right, we had a tied House of Representatives, 67 Democrats, 67 Republicans. No one's in the majority. They had to figure out how are we going to run this show. And then in the Senate, had 34 Democrats and 33 Republicans. So, grand total, we have 201 legislators, and that's 101 Democrats and 100 Republicans. And still have Governor Walz as the governor, but we knew that that was going to, like I have been saying, it presents challenges and opportunities, right? Um, and I think overall, we did a good job of driving home our message about the importance of agriculture, especially as it relates to the state budget. And we were, like I said before too, um, we were really successful at making connections with legislators on both sides of the aisle, and finding, those people who are truly champions for Minnesota agriculture. So um, jumping forward from, I guess, really the start of session to the end. Um, we ended up with a state budget of $66 billion, and that's a 2-year budget. So we call that a biennium here in the state of Minnesota. We have that 2-year budget cycle. Um, and to kind of put into perspective the size of that budget, the budget that was passed 2 years prior in 2023 was $72 billion. So, coming into session, legislators knew that while in the short term, we were looking at a very modest surplus. It was about, I think, $400 million that a little bit further down the road, we had a projected structural deficit of almost $6 billion. And that, we were going to have to make some decisions about as a state about how we were going to address that, right? Um, so really what I think that comes down to is when you have to make cuts in certain areas, you have to kind of, legislators basically they reprioritize items, you have to think about what do we really need, what is maybe less pressing. And really when we came in from the very beginning of session, talking just with everybody, every legislator, we pretty much said, understand that, fiscally times are difficult right now. Difficult decisions will have to be made, but depending on the budget cycle, the amount of the overall state budget that is spent on agriculture is anywhere really from a quarter of a percent to half a percent. So, people who, work on some of the bigger budget jurisdictions, they like to joke that the agriculture budget is essentially a rounding error. But, at the same time, while it's not a lot of money, right, we all know on this call how big of an economic driver agriculture is for our state. And that, the dollars that we do spend as a state on agriculture, we get a huge bang for our buck, huge return on investment. And so, yeah, we were really saying we're not going to balance this budget by, cutting these agriculture programs. It's not really going to add up to a lot. And again, just knowing that we get a good return on that investment, it just didn't seem like from our perspective, a place that made sense to make big cuts to programs. And we were listened to on that. The agriculture budget ended up coming in 9 million above the baseline spending level. Um, and that's in comparison to a lot of, again, bigger budgets, but we're talking about, hundreds of millions in cuts that some other budget jurisdictions faced. And so we were pretty encouraged by the fact that legislators on both sides of the aisle heard us out on that, and that we did get that strong agriculture budget. Um, Now you're probably wondering what was in that budget. And so, I'll start by talking about the agriculture budget, but then I'll jump into some of our other priorities here as well. And so, as you're kind of looking through this list here, um, the policies that are bolded were high priority for us. And if it has a check mark by it, that means it passed. If it has asterisks around it, that means that it failed during session. And so, you can look at the agriculture jurisdiction. And as far as the programs that we were really pushing for, I think, we made out pretty well. I think probably our biggest priority coming in was, in our priority issues, we called it animal emergency response preparedness. And so, like full funding for the Board of Animal Health, right? Because, for the past several years now, they've been working hard to, protect livestock from certain zoonotic diseases like H5N1, avian influenza, certainly others as well. But just understanding that it's been a couple years now that they've been working really hard. But I think, some of their people were probably getting burnt out. And again, just at a high level, want to make sure that they, as an agency, had the resources to do the good work that they're doing. And so we feel that they got the dollars that they needed to continue doing that work. Another resource that's shared between the Board of Animal Health and the Department of Agriculture is the Ag Emergency Account. And the legislature put $1.5 million into that. Um, and that just really, will make sure that we're able to quickly, swiftly respond to, any big agricultural emergencies or again, things related to zoonotic disease outbreaks. Um, and then wolf and elk depredation. So, probably a little bit more familiar for folks who live, more up north, but, livestock up in that area, it's not uncommon at all for them to be attacked by wolves. If you get really far up, kind of in the northwest corner where we have some of our elk populations, they're known, they can really cause some damage to crops as well as fencing. And so the state has two programs that kind of run together that essentially reimburse producers for any losses they might incur as a result of wolf or elk. That was a program that had run out of dollars in the last, actually halfway through the last fiscal year. And so, we'd been trying for the past couple years to get a funding increase for that program, but I think that really was, that helped us make the case as to why it was really important. And that was another area where we were listened to. That program did get some increased funds. So hoping that, it doesn't run out of dollars before the end of the fiscal year again. Um, and then moving on from that, the First District Association for a while now, they do they process milk in Litchfield, and they've been trying to get some dollars to help update their wastewater treatment. They're processing the water that they're processing. So they end up in the agriculture bill, they got $3 million, and then from bonding, they got another 3.5 million. And so, the fear was that if they didn't have the dollars to make these updates to their water processing, that they would have to cut capacity, maybe by a third, maybe by half. And there's about 600 farms that take their milk there. And so we're talking 200, 300 farmers that could have been affected by that if they did have to cut capacity. And, we have members who deliver their milk there, and, we didn't want to see that happen. And so we're, again, encouraged to see that those dollars went towards that and that they're going to be able to work towards making those updates. Um, Another really important program that got a funding increase, the Farm Business Management Program. These are folks who um, they go out to farms who are maybe having trouble cash flowing, or they need to figure out some things with their balance sheet and become more profitable, or just become profitable, period. Um, and obviously the past couple of years have been tough for the ag economy, and talk to some of the folks who do this work, and I think they're feeling the stress. They're feeling, the burden of the emotions that come with doing that work, even though it is really important. And so just again, want to make sure that they're not getting burned out doing that work, because it is super important, especially in a time like now. And just making sure that that program is really topped off with the resources it needs to continue to do the good that it does. So another place where we're glad to see an increase. Soil Health Financial Assistance Program. We didn't get new funding in that program, but at one point there was a chance that that program was going to see a cut. There was a proposal to cut the base funding for that program in half from the House. Fortunately, the final agriculture bill that passed kept that base funding whole, so that program will continue to be funded at the same level that it has the past couple of years. So glad to see that. Um, Rural mental health and farm safety, again, this is a program that doesn't cost a lot of money, but it does a lot of good, as far as, serving farmers, ranchers, rural communities that are having mental health issues, or, grants for farm safety equipment, like, so that think about, the grain bin accidents that happen. We want to prevent those. And so this was a program that did get a little bit of a funding increase. I think in the current budget cycle, they doubled it from 100,000 to 200,000. So again, in the grand scheme of the state budget, even the agriculture budget, not a lot of dollars, but we know how important it is to have that program in place. And then we got some new funding increase for the Male C program, which is the Minnesota Agricultural Education Leadership Council. And then new funding for the Marl program, which is Minnesota Agriculture and Rural Leadership. That's based out of Southwest State, and we have quite a few members who have been super involved with both these organizations. Really, at the end of the day, it's about agricultural education, but also leadership education, and making sure that agriculture is an industry, but also rural Minnesota has the leaders it needs to, I guess, continue, sustaining itself, and being the strong, vital communities that we want them to be. So pleased on those. I think, the one big thing that we were hoping to get, and Loren, maybe you could talk about this one a little bit, it was the restricted use pesticide handler definition. And that kind of came about from some changes that the state ag department had to make to some of their plans that they submitted to the federal government. So,
Mhm.
Lauren, if you want to talk about that one a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so the Department of Agriculture had to come into compliance with some federal regulations from USDA. And so they had to update their pesticide, restricted use pesticide handler definition to sort of include not only the applicator, but also individuals who either transported or mixed that pesticide. And so what we wanted to do was to essentially include update that definition to kind of have anyone that was working under the supervision of the person who had taken the gotten the permit for the RUP application essentially. And we unfortunately had it included in the House agriculture bill, but it ultimately didn't make it through at the very end. This is something we're probably going to be monitoring for the coming year. So, but yep, that's kind of a little update on that one. So,
Yep. Thank you, Lauren. Um, so if there's anything related to the agriculture bill that you were wondering about that you don't see here, um, feel free to ask any questions at the end. I just didn't really have room to include everything. So I kind of had to do some picking and choosing there. But so if there's something you're wondering about that you don't see, definitely write that down as a question for the end. Energy and environment. So we this year joined the Environmental Permitting Reform Coalition, and that was really kind of led up by the Chamber of Commerce. There were in the end with the environment bill, there were some modest changes to permitting reform. Some things around like the air quality program, but I think the big thing that that the coalition didn't get done that they were hoping to was most states you have a different permit for constructing a facility versus operating it. Well, right now in Minnesota, though, that permit is just really one permit. And so that was kind of the big piece of that didn't get done that, hoping in the future can get some progress on that. Um, us again with some of the other with the other ag organizations, we're looking to get a fix on the public waters inventory. So you might recall, um, whether or not, if there's a water running through your property, and it's a public water, that means you have to have a bigger buffer strip compared to if it's not a public water. Um, and in 2024, the legislature basically said that, and I should add, the public waters inventory itself is a map. So if I say just the inventory, I'm talking about the map, and you can go look at it and you can say, okay, this is a public water or it's not. You can look at the inventory and have that sort of certainty. Well, last year the legislature decided to make a change and they went away from the inventory, the map being definitive of if something is a public water or not. And instead they went to this statutory definition that, you know, basically is, it has a set list of criteria that you kind of would have to walk through. And it's just a lot harder to honestly figure out based on that list versus a map whether or not something is a public water. And so essentially we were trying to go back to the way it was prior to the 2024 session where the inventory, whether or not water was a public water was on the inventory on the map, was definitive of whether or not it was a public water. We did have bipartisan support for this provision in the Senate, but ultimately did not move forward this year. And similarly to the Permitting Reform Coalition, we also had joined the Nuclear Alliance, trying to lift Minnesota's nuclear moratorium. Again, just kind of looking for another strong baseload power energy source. Minnesota has had, we have a couple operating nuclear power plants, but as far as constructing new ones, The state has had a moratorium for, I think, the last 30, 35, maybe 40 years. And so that was another one that, had some bipartisan support, but, at the end of the day, unfortunately, couldn't make it across the finish line. And, I think with some of these, you'd think, well, gee, if something has bipartisan support, why couldn't it get done? But I think that's a reflection of, one of the challenges you run into in such an evenly divided legislature is that, again, when you have essentially 101 Democrats, 100 Republicans, there's a strong potential for one legislator to say that they don't really want something or that they don't want to vote for it, and that kind of will put that policy out of play for the year. Um, and again, moving on to labor, earn sick and save time exemption for agriculture. That passed off the Senate floor with strong bipartisan support. But the House never took up the bill. Um, yeah, there's all the Republicans in the Senate and I think maybe six or seven Democrats in the Senate voted for that when it was on the floor. So another one that definitely I think is going to be one to continue to work on next year. That exemption. So that particular bill had a exemption for, I guess, what they called micro businesses. So any business with three or less employees, and then for agricultural businesses had an exemption for farms with five or less full-time employees. There's already a seasonal exemption that they did last year for the sugar beet harvest. Um, and then moving on to taxes, we had quite a few items in taxes that we worked on this year. I think, the foremost one that us and the other agriculture groups were all working on was trying to lift the funding cap off the beginning farmer tax credit. Um, so 2 years ago, they capped that program at $4.5 million a year for the credit. We've seen requests of about 6 or 7 million a year. And so basically, for the first time ever, people got turned away from that program just because there wasn't enough funding. You might have been eligible in every other way, but once the program was out of money, it was out of money. So essentially, we were trying to make sure that that didn't happen down the road. Um, we got that included in the Senate tax bill. Again, strong bipartisan support, but um, the House chose not to accept it in negotiations. Same thing with the next one, the limited liability company eligibility for the beginning farmer tax credit. So this would have allowed, if your farm is structured as an LLC and you meet all the other beginning farmer requirements, that whatever, asset you receive through that program, whether it be land, equipment, livestock, you could put that under the ownership of your LLC as opposed to under yourself as an individual. Again, strong bipartisan support, made the Senate tax bill, but House didn't have the appetite for it. And that also happened with some of the updates for the special ag homestead. We had one that would have, expanded essentially two provisions that really would have modernized special ag homestead. One regarding, which family members can farm the property once the owner, assuming it's probably like a grandparent, moves off. So it would have allowed like, stepchildren or first cousins, nephews, nieces, aunts, uncles, that sort of thing. And we thought that was pretty common sense. Another one that would have essentially allowed people using special ag homestead to move closer to healthcare as they age. And those both made it in the Senate bill, bipartisan support, but didn't survive negotiations at the end. Um, and then we had a few different bills that we were working on in relation to trying to, either phase out or create a larger exemption to the estate tax. Um, and those didn't get included in either tax, or I should say either the House or Senate tax bill, but always something that we're kind of every year keeping an eye on. Had another bill to exempt grain bins and tractor tires from sales taxes. That one was heard in the Senate Tax Committee, but didn't make it any further than that. Um, Once again, we had the agricultural water quality certification program tax credit. So would have provided some incentive for people who enroll in that program excuse me, with the Department of Agriculture. Um, that one got heard in both the House and the Senate. Um, was initially included in the Senate tax bill, but that was as far as it made it. And then the sustainable aviation fuel tax credit, um, both the GOP House tax chair and the Senate tax chair carried this bill trying to put more money into that credit. Um, but ultimately, that one did not succeed either. Excuse me. So moving on to opposed policy, compared to the last couple of years, there was actually a lot less of things we had to play defense on, which is always a positive. And, again, I talk about opportunities and challenges with such a divided legislature. One of the upsides of that is, um, things that could be potentially really detrimental to agriculture, um, have less of a chance of making it into law or even really getting a hearing or moving forward at all. So we did see one bill that was heard on an informational basis in the Senate that would have essentially, among other things, required a verification of need for treated seeds. So if you were going to buy corn that had a seed treatment on it, you would have to basically prove that you needed it for a very specific problem, um, that you didn't have alternatives that you could use, essentially all that kind of thing. Obviously we understand that this is a really important tool, especially early on and when you plant crops, protecting them early on, making sure they get the nutrients they need, and just allowing targeted use of some of these, agricultural chemicals. Um, so that was one that we very much opposed. Um, just got an informational hearing, so is really just kind of a chance for both sides to say their part, but didn't have any movement. We also saw again the subsurface drain tile disclosure bill come forward. That one didn't get a hearing in either body, but it was one that still kept an eye on. There was a bill in the Senate that had a few hearings related to added protections for wild rice waters from pesticides. I think for us, there was some concerns about that around, adding those protections. Would that open up some kind of potential, litigation or legal liability for farmers in Minnesota? And that's not something that we want to see. So, but that bill didn't really make it further than just having a few hearings on the Senate side. Um, and then there was a bill to increase penalties for employee misclassification. It would have been like a $10,000 penalty for every employee misrepresented, or yeah, I should say misclassified. And kind of there's a push around that to really just kind of make the assumption that someone's not an independent contractor, that they are an employee. But obviously there's a variety of reasons why it's important in agriculture, both whether you're the independent contractor or the farmer, to be able to kind of choose the nature of that business relationship. So, um, fortunately, that huge added $10,000 penalty did not make it into any final legislation. And then the last opposed policy that we were working on this session was the right to repair bill. Saw that come forward again. We were a bit disappointed at first to see some GOP sponsors on that, but we as the public policy team went around and had conversations with the folks who had signed on to that legislation, and through those conversations, we were fortunate to have a number of those legislators actually remove their name from the bill, and I think that just speaks to when you have clear communication with a legislator and a chance to just kind of give your side of the story, that can change minds and change understandings of issues. So, pretty proud of the conversations that we had on that, and just making sure that we don't end up with a regulatory state to state patchwork with regard to that particular issue. Um, and then honorable mentions. Uh, these were two that, um, frankly, as an organization, we were neutral on. We just didn't really have any policy that steered us much one way or the other. So actually, the top one here, the financial reporting requirements for grain buyers modification, was the first bill that got passed into law of the session. Um, Essentially, kind of scaling based on, if you're a grain buyer, depending on what scale you're doing it at, the stringency of some of the financial reporting you have to do. But I guess I should add that, like, there, it didn't just, say, okay, you don't sell that much or you don't buy that much grain, so you don't have to report anything. That's not at all the case. Definitely think it's important for those financials to be submitted to the Department of Agriculture for them to review and keep an eye on things. But just understanding that, yeah, maybe if you're really small and you have to do a full audit and it's going to cost you $20,000, you might not be able to bear the burden of that cost. So just kind of doing it in a way that makes a little more sense, based on the scale of grain buying that you're at. And then this other one, implements of husbandry speed limit increased to 35 miles per hour. Um, it was unbeknownst to me before, but apparently prior to this bill passing into law, um, some implements of husbandry the speed limit was 30 miles an hour. For some, it was 35. So this just went ahead and moved them all to 35 miles an hour. Maybe some of you had been aware of that issue before, but that was another one that passed that just thought it might be good for you guys to all know about. Um, that's what I have to say as far as my presentation.